Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to introduce our next keynote speaker. He is a graduate of Georgia Tech, Emory University, and Emory Law School. After duty with the United States Coast Guard, he entered politics and was elected to the Georgia House of Representatives in 1968. In 1972, he was elected to the United States Senate, where he served 24 years, most notably as chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. During our speaker's years in the Senate, he gained a reputation for stellar legislative achievement. His historic accomplishments include the Department of Defense Reorganization Act, drafted with Senator Barry Goldwater, and the Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, which provides assistance to the states of the former Soviet Union in securing and destroying excess nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. By the time he left the Senate, our speaker had become perhaps our foremost congressional expert on national defense issues. Respected by his colleagues on both sides of the aisle, he embodied the spirit of bipartisanship that represents the very best in American foreign policy. Since leaving office, he has continued to demonstrate his commitment to public policy. He is a distinguished professor at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech and chairman of the board of the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Our speaker is also co-chairman and CEO of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, which we're all aware here in this group, which is dedicated to reducing global threats from nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. In short, there is simply no American better qualified by experience and expertise to speak with authority on the subject of nonproliferation. We are delighted, Senator, that you can join us today from Atlanta. Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable Sam Nunn.
Thank you very much, and I thank all of you who are there at Rice today for devoting your weekend to such an enormously important subject. Are you hearing me okay on that end? Just testing? Okay? Everything fine? Mm-hmm. I'm accustomed to teleconferencing, not always working, so we'll see if we go. If you have a problem, let us know. In this day of resume enhancement, where we read time after time where people get in trouble by either enhancing their resumes or letting something that is enhanced go unnoticed, I have to correct. I did not graduate from Georgia Tech. I appreciate the thought. I did go to 3 years at Georgia Tech. I found that I could not pass mechanical drawing. I had a complete vacuum in my mind about seeing those kind of spatial relationships, having made a D on the third time around in 101 and having the task of trying to pass 102 and 103, I decided I was going to be a lawyer. So I went to the military for 6 months and then came back and went to Emory Law School and never got my degree at Georgia Tech, but they did name the International School after me now. My office is located there. So I consider myself a tech man, but no degree. You know, when you think about where we've come in the last 50 years in terms of the space between the time that Dwight Eisenhower made his Atoms for Peace proposal to the UN, it is miraculous in terms of what has happened, in terms of both nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. Eisenhower said in his speech to the United Nations in 1953 that we needed to, quoting him, to find the way by which the miraculous inventiveness of man shall not be dedicated to his death, but consecrated to his life, end quote. And I know that's what this discussion this weekend is all about with those of you who've gathered, and I know from the recognition of names that you have a tremendous reservoir of knowledge and experience and judgment around that table. When you look back on 1948 on Veterans Day at the dawn of the nuclear age after the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, General Omar Bradley said in a speech, and I quote General Bradley, "The world has achieved brilliance without wisdom, power without conscience. Ours is a world of nuclear giants and ethical infants. We know more about war than we know about peace, more about killing than we know about living," end quote. It might surprise both General Bradley and General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower also, if he were alive today or if they were alive today, to know that we made it 60 years without a nuclear catastrophe. Thousands of men and women thought deeply and worked diligently on both sides of the Iron Curtain during a period of tremendous tension, a long period of tension, to prevent nuclear war and to avoid overreaching and overreacting to what could be false warnings, and also to provide safety mechanisms and joint understanding to reduce risk. We take a lot of that for granted today until we see something like recently happened with our Air Force plane, where they by mistake put nuclear weapons on board and flew around the United States without knowing it and without securing the weapons after they landed. So that reminds us that we're talking about a tremendous risk, and we're talking about very high stakes. Back during the Cold War, we were good, so were the Soviets. We were diligent, but both of us were also very, very lucky, and the world was lucky. We had more than a few close calls, including the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, the 1979 scare when a technician at Omaha accidentally loaded a simulated attack into our warning system, the 1983 Soviet warning glitch, which falsely showed 5 nuclear missiles launched against it by the United States, and of course, India and Pakistan have already had more than one close call, and their nuclear age has just begun. So, Mr. Ambassador and Jim Baker, my friend for many years, I thank you personally for gathering this group of experts and for focusing on an issue where the stakes are very high. Making it through 60 years without a nuclear attack should not make us complacent. In the future, it won't be enough to be lucky once or twice, or for one country or two countries to be lucky. If we're to avoid a catastrophe, all nuclear powers will have to have highly capable, careful, competent, rational, and lucky, and they'll have to be lucky every single time. We do have important preventive efforts underway, and all of you are there, I know, are familiar with them, including the Non-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, the Global Threat Reduction Initiative, the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism, the Proliferation Security Initiative, the rollback of Libya's nuclear program, as well as UN Resolution 1540. These are all important. They all mark progress and potential, but from my perspective, the risk of a nuclear weapon being used today is growing, not receding. The storm clouds are gathering. Terrorists are seeking nuclear weapons, and there can be little doubt they'll use them if they acquire them. There are nuclear weapons in more than 40 countries, weapons materials in more than 40 countries, some secured by nothing more than a chain-link fence, and at the current pace it will take several decades before this nuclear material is adequately secured or eliminated in the long run globally. The know-how and expertise to build nuclear weapons is far more available today because of an explosion of information and commerce throughout the world. The number of nuclear weapon states is increasing. Iran and North Korea's nuclear programs threaten to spark a nuclear arms race in the Middle East and Asia. All of us know that a world with 12 or 20 nuclear weapon states will be immeasurably more dangerous than today's world and make it more likely that weapons or materials will fall into the hands of terrorists. Our worst nightmare, the spread of nuclear capability to terrorist groups with no return address and little way of being deterred, will become more likely. With the growing interest in nuclear energy, and I know that's also on the agenda, and the correlation between nuclear energy and proliferation, with that growing interest, a number of countries are considering developing the capacity to enrich uranium ostensibly to use as fuel for nuclear energy. But this would also give them the capacity to move quickly to a nuclear weapons program if they choose to do so. The New York Times recently reported that roughly a dozen states in the Middle East have recently turned to the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, for help in starting their own nuclear programs. Meanwhile, the nuclear giants of the United States and Russia continue to deploy thousands of nuclear weapons on ballistic missiles that can hit their targets in less than 30 minutes. A short warning time, prompt launch capability that from my perspective carries with it an increasingly unacceptable risk of an accidental, mistaken, or unauthorized launch. The bottom line, the accelerating spread of nuclear weapons, nuclear know-how, and nuclear material has brought us to a nuclear tipping point, and the world is heading in a very dangerous direction. Dean Acheson was once asked his definition of foreign policy. He thought for a moment, he paused for quite a little while, and then he said, the best definition I can give is that foreign policy is one damn thing after another. It seems that we are facing that in the nuclear proliferation field. The greatest danger of the Cold War we addressed primarily by confrontation with Moscow. The greatest threats we face today, catastrophic terrorism, a rise in the number of nuclear weapon states, increased danger of mistaken, accidental, or unauthorized nuclear launch, we can prevent only in cooperation with Moscow, but also with Beijing and many other capitals, including our allies who have nuclear weapons. We must change direction. The good news is that I believe the security and economic interests of the great powers, the U.S., Russia, China, Europe, Japan, India, have never been more aligned. As Henry Kissinger says, quoting him, "The great powers have nothing to gain by military conflict with each other. They're all dependent on the global economic system," end quote. Old rivalries should not keep us from seeing common interests today, even where we differ with other countries in terms of current issues. Both leaders and citizens here and abroad must reflect on what is at stake. If al-Qaeda had hit the trade towers with a small crude nuclear weapon instead of 2 airplanes, a fireball would have vaporized everything in the vicinity. Lower Manhattan and the financial district would be ash and rubble. Tens of thousands of people would have been killed instantly. Those who survived would have been left with no shelter, no clean water, no safe food, and probably no medical attention. Telecommunications, utilities, transportation, and rescue services would have been thrown into chaos. And this would have just been the physical impact. If you were to try to draw a circle to mark the overall impact of the blast in social, economic, and security terms, the circle would be the equator itself. No part of the planet would escape the impact. Everybody, everywhere, would fear another blast. Travel, international trade, capital flows, commerce would virtually stop, and many freedoms we've come to take for granted would be quickly eroded in the name of security. The confidence of America and the world would be shaken to the core. I think that is true wherever the explosion occurs in the world. With these growing dangers and stakes in mind, George Shultz, Bill Perry, Henry Kissinger, and I published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal in January that called for a different direction for our global nuclear policy with both visions and steps. We said that the U.S. leadership will be required to take the world to the next stage, to a solid consensus for reversing the reliance on nuclear weapons globally. We see that reversal of reliance as a vital contribution to preventing their proliferation into potentially dangerous hands and ultimately ending them as a threat to the world. We underscored the importance of intensive work with leaders of the countries in possession of nuclear weapons to turn the goal of a world without nuclear weapons into a joint enterprise. We made the point that terrorist groups are conceptually outside the bounds of a deterrent strategy, and even among states, unless urgent new actions are taken, the United States will find itself in a nuclear era more precarious, psychologically disorienting, and economically even more costly than the Cold War deterrence period. The four of us and many other former security leaders who joined us are keenly aware that the quest for a nuclear weapons-free world is fraught with practical and political challenges. As The Economist magazine wisely said about a year ago, quoting that magazine, by simply demanding the goal of a world without nuclear weapons, without a readiness to tackle the practical problems raised by it, ensures that it will never happen. End quote. We've taken aim at the practical problems by laying out a series of steps that we believe constitute the urgent new actions for reducing the nuclear dangers and lay the groundwork for building a world free of nuclear weapons. The specific steps are as follows, and I'm sure that other steps will become essential as we move through this process. First, the United States and Russia should move to change the Cold War posture of their deployed nuclear weapons to greatly increase warning time in both countries and ease our fingers away from the nuclear trigger. Second, nuclear forces should be reduced substantially in all states that possess them. Third, we must eliminate short-range tactical nuclear weapons, the bombs most likely to be targeted for theft or purchased by terrorists, beginning with accountability and transparency between the United States and Russia. And even that step, as apparent as it seems to us today, will be very difficult, as Rose Gottemiller pointed out in a conference 2 or 3 weeks ago at Stanford, That's a tough step for the Russians to contemplate now. Nevertheless, that's got to be on the agenda. Fourth, we must work to bring the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty into force in the United States and in other key states. Fifth, we must secure nuclear weapons and materials around the world to the highest possible standards. This involves states far beyond the nuclear weapon states and involves every state that has dangerous nuclear material. Sixth, we must get control of the uranium enrichment process for civil nuclear fuel production, phase out the use of highly enriched uranium in civil commerce, and halt the production of fissile material for weapons. And I know that Tariq will be able to address the updated version of what the IAEA is doing in that respect. Seventh, we must redouble efforts to resolve the regional confrontations that increase demand for nuclear weapons. And all of us know that is very easy to say and extremely difficult to do. But it has to be, all of those regional confrontations have to be on the front burner of the world. Eighth, we must enhance our verification capabilities. President Reagan's credo, trust but verify, has been largely forgotten. We must make at least as much effort in building verification procedures and technology as we are now making in the missile defense technology arena. Each of these steps will help reverse the spread of nuclear weapons. Each step is valuable, not only for its ability to inspire greater cooperation, but for its own sake. Each step represents a move in the right direction. Each step reduces the risk of nuclear use. None of these steps can be taken by the United States alone. Strategic cooperation must become the cornerstone of our national defense against nuclear weapons. This is not because cooperation will give us a warm feeling of community, but because every other method will fail. I have concluded that we cannot defend America without taking these steps. We cannot take these steps without the cooperation of other nations. We cannot get the cooperation of other nations without the vision and hope of a world that will someday end these weapons of mass destruction as a threat to the world. The vision and the actions must go together. Without the bold vision, the actions will not be perceived as fair or urgent by much of the world. Without the actions, the vision will not be perceived as realistic or possible by much of the world. All of us know this cannot happen overnight. It will be a long process, done in stages. The United States must keep our nuclear weapons as long as other nations do. But we will be safer and the world will be safer if we are working toward the goal of de-emphasizing nuclear weapons and ultimately ridding the world of them. The vision of a nuclear-free world is not new. In his memoirs, President Reagan wrote, quoting him, "For the 8 years I was president, I never let the dream of a nuclear-free world fade from my mind," end quote. In the 1960s, at an earlier tipping point in the nuclear age, it was the vision of a nuclear weapons-free world that pulled us back from the edge. It came in the form of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It was the grand bargain of the nuclear age, designed to limit the number of nuclear weapon states in the world. The treaty, as we know, was built on three premises: the Article 6 commitment of nuclear weapon states to move toward nuclear disarmament, the commitment of non-nuclear weapon states to forego nuclear weapons, and the commitment that all nations should have access to nuclear technology for peaceful purposes. This treaty and its vision of a world free of nuclear weapons has been successful in keeping the number of nuclear weapon states below what almost anyone in the 1960s expected by today. But today the treaty is in trouble. In the eyes of its critics, the treaty has served to enshrine the nuclear weapons inequalities that existed the day it was signed. As the critics see it, those who had nuclear weapons on that day continue to keep them. Those who didn't, tough luck. There can be endless argument about exactly what Article 6 commitment means and the timetable. But from my personal perspective, it must mean at least this: nuclear weapon states must visibly and steadily reduce their reliance on nuclear weapons. Today, the world believes they are not, and that belief has a clear and increasingly negative impact on our efforts to prevent the spread and use of nuclear weapons. As Director Alberday of the IAEA said recently, quoting him, "It's hard to tell people not to smoke when you have a cigarette dangling from your mouth," end quote. Recently, former Russian President Gorbachev endorsed the views expressed in the Wall Street Journal op-ed, and he specifically stated in reply, Quote, the members of the nuclear club should formally reiterate their commitment to reducing and ultimately eliminating nuclear weapons. As a token of their serious intent, they should without delay take two crucial steps: ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and make changes in their military doctrine, removing nuclear weapons from the Cold War high alert status. End quote. I believe the world should take up President Gorbachev's challenge. We should ask ourselves a long overdue question. 16 years after the Cold War, is it in the United States' national security interest for the President of Russia to have only a few minutes to decide whether to fire his nuclear weapons or lose them in response to what could be a false warning? How can anyone think that this is in our security interest? I would hope this question would be asked in reverse in Russia, and that we would begin to ask it together. If both the United States and Russia altered their Cold War alert postures and significantly increased warning and decision time for both countries, we could dramatically reduce the chances of an accidental, mistaken, or unauthorized launch. The benefits of working with Russia to remove our weapons from hair-trigger alert have benefits beyond reducing the risk we pose to one another. If we remove our nuclear missiles from hair-trigger and at the same time reduce our numbers of nuclear weapons, it will greatly strengthen our fight against the spread of nuclear weapons, and it will begin down the important road of building transparency and trust. This is not because our example will inspire Iran, North Korea, or Al-Qaeda to say we've seen the light, but because many more nations will be willing to join us in a firm and vigorous approach to stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons and materials and prevent catastrophic terrorism, and to take whatever sanctions are needed to have that occur. The power of this kind of international pressure is crucial. If a strong coalition of nations band together, it can exert powerful economic, diplomatic, and military pressure to prevent new nuclear weapon states and make it much less likely that terrorists can get the materials they need to build a nuclear weapon. The reaction of many people to the vision and steps to eliminate the nuclear threat comes in two parts. On the one hand, most people say that would be great. And their second thought is, how do we ever get there from here? To me, the goal of a world free of nuclear weapons is like the top of a very tall mountain. It's tempting and easy to look up and say we can't get there from here. And it is true that today in our troubled world, we can't really see the top of the mountain. But we can see that we're heading down, not up. We can see that we must turn around, that we must take paths leading to higher ground, and that we must get others to move with us. We can see that there are trails leading upward. We can work with the Russians to remove weapons from hair-trigger alert and increase warning and decision time for both Russia and the United States. We can work with other nations to reduce the number of nuclear weapons in the world. We can work harder and faster and get many more nations to contribute to secure and eliminate nuclear weapons materials that could be bought or stolen by terrorists. We can agree on transparency, accountability, and near-term elimination of short-range battlefield nuclear weapons, a terrorist dream. And I would also add to my personal agenda that we need biological transparency in the work we do on defensive biological weapons, beginning with the United States and Russia. We can greatly strengthen our verification capabilities, both in technology and in policy. We can redouble our efforts to ease regional confrontations, which greatly increase the demand side of the nuclear equation. All of these are tough steps, no doubt about it, but they're doable. Once we get to higher ground, there will still be serious obstacles between us and the top of the mountain. We must develop ironclad verification procedures and assurances for monitoring and enforcing a prohibition on nuclear weapons. We must be able to respond quickly and decisively to any attempt to cheat, and we means the world. Today it's very apparent that our capability in this regard needs considerable strengthening. Both the good news and the bad news is that given the big steps required to move upward, we have time to work on the transition from higher ground to the top. It's not too soon to begin. Let me close with a parable of hope, and some people sitting around the table played a big role in this, but others may not know about it, and if you don't, I think it is a very hopeful sign of things that are possible. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, when the United States began funding Russia's work to dismantle Soviet nuclear missiles and warheads, our countries struck a deal called the U.S.-Russia Highly Enriched Uranium Agreement. Under this agreement, which was signed in 1993, 500 tons of highly enriched uranium from former Soviet nuclear warheads is being blended down to low-enriched uranium and then used as fuel for nuclear power plants in the United States. Shipments began in 1995 and will continue through 2013. If you calculate that 20% of all electricity in the United States comes from nuclear power plants and 50% of the nuclear fuel used in the U.S. comes from Russia through this highly enriched uranium agreement, you have an interesting fact. Roughly speaking, 1 out of every 10 light bulbs in America today is powered by material that was in Soviet nuclear warheads pointed at us just a few years back. From swords to plowshares. Who would have thought this was possible in the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, or the 1980s? It would certainly have been seen as a mountain too high to climb. Nearly 20 years ago, President Reagan asked his audience to imagine, and I'm quoting him, imagine that, quote, all of us discovered that we were threatened by a power from outer space, from another planet. The president then asked, wouldn't we come together to fight that particular threat? After letting that image sink in for a moment, President Reagan came to his point. We now have a weapon that can destroy the world. Why don't we recognize that threat more clearly and then come together with one aim in mind? How safely, sanely, and quickly can we rid the world of this threat to our civilization and to our existence, end quote. If we want our children and grandchildren to ever see the mountaintop, our generation must begin to answer this question. And again, I thank you for letting me share these thoughts with you today, and I look forward to the results of your conference and certainly would like a dialogue now if we have time remaining. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator, for these excellent remarks. Secretary Baker was with us this morning, and he sends you his best regards and sang your praises and of your work in this field, and certainly supports all your initiatives, sir. I want to open up. I want to make one thing clear. Is this question and answer period with the Senator's approval webcast? Okay. Just want you to know that this is webcast, so it will be public. It goes beyond this room in terms of the informal discussion also. All right. The floor. Okay. Michael Interrogator.
Hello, Senator Nunn. Thank you for that fine address. Will add a lot to our proceedings. I want to ask you about a point you touched on and Secretary Baker also emphasized this morning, which is nuclear terrorism, nuclear weapons in the hands of terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda and company. You know, Graham Allison published this book, Nuclear Terrorism, and he said it's a solvable problem. How do we solve the problem? No new nuclear states, no nascent nuclear states, and we lock up all of the fissile material around the world with a gold standard using the concept of Fort Knox, where we never lost a speck of gold. We do the same thing for fissile material. It's a laudable goal. It's a great idea, but I think it's too late. There's too much fissile material floating around the world to lock it all up at this point. And I just wonder your reaction to that, particularly Graham Allison's ideas and my critique of his ideas.
Well, I think that should be our goal. You know, if the goal of locking up 100% is not our goal, would we choose 50% or would we choose 90%? In which case, we still would have enough out there to blow up a lot of cities in the world. So I think it has to be our goal. To me, that on the nuclear material side, that's also the top of the mountain. We've made enormous progress in recent years in basically better securing a lot of material in the former Soviet Union, and we've started down the road of getting material in other countries that is highly enriched uranium, weapon-grade material, back to the Soviet Union and back to the United States where it's blended down and put in safe conditions. So we are moving toward the right goal in that. I view it as something that is going to be difficult, and I view it as a race between cooperation and catastrophe because we have to have a lot of countries in the world working together on it. So I don't take any issue with Graham on having that as the goal. I certainly don't take any issue with you on saying it's going to be extremely difficult. The way I view it, if a nuclear weapon goes off in any city, we'll be asking ourselves, what about the next one and the next one? So it's not simply preventing the first attack, although that's important. It's preventing a repetition of those attacks over a period of time. So this is the way I view it. In terms of statistics, Warren Buffett, he's pretty good with math, as we all know. And the way he stated this once in a letter to me, and I've used it a lot of times since then, is that if you assume there's a 10% chance of a catastrophic nuclear bomb going off somewhere in the world, and that chance in 1 year, and that chance persists for 50 years. So 10% chance in 1 year, assuming that, it persists for 50 years. There's a 99.5% chance that over that 50-year period we will have a nuclear catastrophe. But if you can reduce that 10% chance per year to 1% chance, and that 1% persists over 50 years, then you have a 67.5% chance of avoidance over that same 50-year period. So that's the way I view the challenge. We've got to do everything we can in this regard, but we're under no illusions that it's going to be easy. I would add to that something that I hope you'll discuss at the conference. I think I see Joe sitting next to you. The fissile material cutoff. It's one thing to get weapon material under control in the former Soviet Union. It's another thing to get it controlled around the globe. But then at the same time, if it's continued to be produced, you're running on a rug. So that's one of the things that I think has to be a priority, and I hope you all will talk about that. I think we have to have a verifiable fissile material cutoff treaty, and I hope at least the next administration will make that one of their top priorities, whether it's Republican or Democratic. Again, it's going to take cooperation from around the globe, but it's an enormously important goal.
Thank you, Senator. Henry Sokolsky.
Senator, thank you very much for that presentation. I think it's good to hear these presentations because it makes everybody think twice about how serious they are, and it's good to put us really in a position where we have to think about what might happen if we fail to prevent some weapons from going off. Now, in that regard, I'm curious, is there anything that you've encountered in your efforts or have thought about doing perhaps in the future to kind of alert the American public about what might happen if indeed a weapon did go off? I mean, you mentioned civil liberties. I think that's an incredibly serious point. Our reaction to these events could easily be almost as bad as the event itself in some case, because transaction costs and the rest. But it must be the case that we can mitigate to some extent really dumb policy reactions. And it might be useful, particularly coming from someone with legislative experience, to at least warn us off from some of the silly ideas that we're likely to hear from all of our leadership when one of these terrible events occur. That then brings me to a more comic question, perhaps once more time with feeling. What do you make of this Indian deal? How important is this Indian nuclear deal to slowing down some of the trends that you see being negative? Those are my two questions.
Two good questions. Let's just take the first one on in terms of how we could prepare and at least mitigate some of the extreme reactions that may take place if we do have a disaster. You know, we know that a dirty bomb, a radiological weapon, would not kill anything like the number of people, and it would not be anything like the disaster that a catastrophic explosion would be. But a dirty bomb would be psychologically devastating to the nuclear power industry. It would set back the efforts that are now being made in nuclear power around the globe. It would give people the feeling that everything nuclear was dangerous. I think it would greatly complicate life in whatever area it went off, because it takes a long time to clean up. It could immobilize an area. But I think if we have a dirty bomb go off today, we're not psychologically prepared for it. And I believe we could educate the public and the news media about the difference between a radiological weapon and a nuclear explosion in a way that we haven't done so far, and greatly mitigate the damage that would come out of that kind of incident. When you look at the odds of a dirty bomb or a radiological weapon going off, in my view, are much higher than the odds of a nuclear explosion. There's nuclear material all around that's not weapon-grade material. Hospitals and a lot of other places, we've got to do a lot better job in that regard. But we could also greatly mitigate the potential reaction, overreaction to a dirty bomb incident. And frankly, I think that there is a pretty strong likelihood somewhere in the world that will happen at some point. In terms of preparing for a nuclear explosion, when you look at the consequences, I'm not sure there's much we can do to mitigate some of the psychological aspects of that. I think the more we talk about in advance the importance of civil liberties, and the more we plan in advance and play war games in advance in terms of how we would react, the more likely it is we will avoid a serious governmental type reaction that is demanded by the American people. But it's going to be severe no matter what. No matter what we do, we shouldn't kid ourselves. A catastrophic nuclear bomb going off in an American city or a Russian city or a city in Europe or Japan would be absolute disaster, and I think it would shake up the globe. One thing that we have to do at some point, and I think the sooner the better, is basically let the world know that countries that have nuclear materials are working together to identify those materials in a forensic way, so that if a weapon does go off, we will be able to trace the source and make sure that we don't have the second, third, and fourth going off. I think there's some effort being made on the scientific side of that, and certainly that's an important ingredient, but I don't see a lot of effort being made on the political side of that. And I think that one is enormously important. So yes, there are things we can do, and I would put at the top of the list preparing for a radiological weapon, preparing the public and the news media. On the India question, I was not in favor of the Indian deal. I felt if we were going to enter into a deal with India, that we should do so with at least some forward progress, because there's no doubt about a deal with India has a downside, particularly when you're trying to deal with Iran and North Korea, and you're trying to enlist the world to deal with those two countries and prevent them from becoming nuclear powers. So there's a downside. I thought we could have mitigated the downside if we had gotten India and the United States to jointly announce the launching of a fissile material cutoff, so that these two countries would have pledged to lead the world to seek a cutoff of the production of all weapon-grade fissile material everywhere, including but not limited to India. Certainly India would never have agreed to do it unilaterally. That would have been a price too high, but I felt at the time it was negotiated that should have been at least one of our goals. I don't think we got much for the Indian deal. We already were improving relations with India, and I would stipulate that relations with India are enormously important. The way I see it now, with the deal stalled, we have a chance, I think, to have a broader vision with India, and I hope that we will take advantage of that broader vision so that whatever we do in terms of that particular deal, we broaden the agenda and get India signed up for a real leadership role in the world to tackle a lot of these problems, even though they're not officially a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Thank you, Senator. Bill Potter.
Thank you very much, Senator, for spending part of your Saturday with us. I know you don't like to use the term de-alerting, but that was the name in a recent UN resolution that enjoyed overwhelming support last week at the First Committee at the United Nations. If I'm not mistaken, only 3 countries voted against the resolution, those 3 countries being the United States, France, and Great Britain. Even Russia, if I'm not mistaken, abstained. I wonder if you could help us try to understand why the United States in particular seems to be in such a state of denial regarding the risks posed by the short warning time and the short fuse.
You know, the term de-alerting is descriptive, and I don't object to others using it, but I do think it's more appropriate and much broader and more politically palatable, particularly people in the military who spent all their years in military service trying to be alert, and then you all of a sudden come along with a theory that we want you now to be de-alert. That, to me, is not the right language. I think the language in de-alerting could be one part of this, but it is increasing warning time. There are a lot of ways to increase warning time. De-alerting is one of those main ways, and if you separate the warheads from the missile, which would be, if you did that in all of our inventories or in most of the inventories, the U.S. and Russia, you would go a long way in that regard. But there are other ways, for instance, where you deploy your submarines, the survivability of forces. There are a lot of ways, and Bruce Blair's done a lot of good work on this. So I cannot answer, frankly, I cannot answer the question you posed of why this administration has not basically availed themselves of what I consider to be the opportunity to enhance America's security by proposing that U.S. and Russia begin by taking most of our weapons off of hair-trigger alert and then moving eventually to all of them. That'll take some time. It'll take some effort. But can you think of a scenario if both U.S. and Russia had no more than 500 weapons on what I call prompt launch alert or hair-trigger alert, a scenario that we couldn't handle or they couldn't handle? I mean, 500 nuclear weapons, particularly if we work to make them survivable, and I think it's in our interest for the Russians' warheads to be survivable. And I think it's in their interest for ours to be, so that neither one of us feel if we get a warning we've got to fire fast or we lose them. That's a terribly dangerous posture, and I think greatly detracts from our own national security. So I cannot answer the question why this administration has not moved in that regard, but it is still hope, and I think that there's a lot of discussion on it. I think the UN resolution and the attention that has been paid to this by the Wall Street Journal editorial, as well as what Gorbachev said, as well as Margaret Beckett's, Foreign Secretary of Great Britain's speech on this subject, I think all of that is building some momentum. The strangest paradox to me is if you go back and read in the 2000 election, then Governor George W. Bush made a speech in which he basically called for the de-alerting of the maximum possible number of American nuclear missiles. I'm not quoting him exactly, I don't have the quote, but he used that specific language, using the de-alerting language, and pledged to do that as president. The only thing I can figure out is somebody has convinced the president that the Moscow Treaty has fulfilled that pledge, and in my view, that Moscow Treaty doesn't address the prompt launch capability, so I don't think it fulfills that presidential pledge at all. So I'm puzzled by this, and I would hope people that are close to the administration would bring this message to the president, because what the UN resolution said, in effect, was pretty close, very close to what he said in his campaign in 2000.
Thank you, sir. Bob Gallucci?
Thank you, Senator, for the address this morning. I wanted to follow up on one of the points you made just a few minutes ago about this effort at achieving attribution, the technical effort to be able to attribute either an undetonated nuclear weapon or the source of fissile material from a detonated.
Could you talk a little closer to the mic? I'm not picking that up very well.
Okay. Is this better?
That's a lot better. Thank you.
All right. Senator, I wanted to follow up on the question of the attribution. The idea that we'll be able to identify the source of fissile material if we get an undetonated nuclear weapon, or if there is a detonation, from an analysis of the debris. Not only might it help, some argue, to deal with the second detonation, but it might, in a sense, recreate some deterrence. Deterrence of the transfer of fissile material in the first place from a nation state to a terrorist group. So if we were now thinking of the terrorist with a nuclear weapon problem and wondering where they would get the fissile material, typically these days we think of it coming from two kinds of sources. Either it is transferred from a nation state that makes the decision to do so, an authorized transfer, from, for example, North Korea or eventually from Iran, or it comes from a sort of leakage from a country like Russia or Pakistan, where neither political leaders decide to transfer the material, but it leaks out as a result of one kind of activity or another. The idea here is that if you could attribute the source of the fissile material and you persuaded countries that you would know in advance or you'd know eventually where the material came from, you could discourage or you could deter countries from transferring the material. That's, I think, pretty clear. There is a little bit of a debate, though, about whether it helps at all with those countries that would be leaking the material. And I want to put this question to you because it requires something of a political judgment and also a knowledge particularly of where we are in securing material in Russia and the extent to which the Russians have been cooperative with us. So the question is, if we had this capability to attribute with reasonably high confidence, we could tell North Korea that if they transferred, we would treat them as the source of the material for the attack on the United States. But what would we tell Russia? Would we tell Russia in advance that if there's a detonation on American soil and we find that the material came from Russia originally, we would do what? Could we say that, or would we, or should we say that an American president could not let this information become public and be expected to do nothing about it if the Russians were known not to have been fully cooperative with us in trying to secure their material? Would they bear responsibility and a sort of a sense of legal negligence? Or is that concept ridiculous because of Russia's nuclear weapons capability? I've been puzzling about this, and I know that I thought it was possible, in fact, to tell the Russians that we could not stand by, or an American president could not stand by and do nothing, and hopefully as a result of that observation, we could get even more cooperation from the Russians than we have to date. But I wonder if that is silly.
No, I don't think that's silly. I think what you have already identified, you have probably, no doubt, thought more depth about this than I probably have. But I think you're right in terms of what we probably deter is a narrow scope of the spectrum, and that is the authorized transfer from a government to a terrorist group. I think if we could establish forensically that actually took place, let's say a North Korean turnover to Al-Qaeda with enough material to make a crude weapon, and they blew up American City, and I think if we could trace that back to North Korea, that they would need to understand in advance that would be an act of war against the United States, and they would suffer the consequences of that. So that authorized transfer, I think, can possibly be at least plausibly deterred. I think the leakage problem is much harder, and deterrence probably doesn't play a huge role there, except the role of public opinion in the world. But I wouldn't diminish that exception. And if you look at UN Resolution 1540, some of you there will probably remember the exact words of it, but it puts a pretty explicit burden on every country in the world, a legal requirement to basically protect their nuclear materials and to be accountable for those nuclear materials. The problem is that resolution is not self-enforcing. It doesn't say what happens if they do not, and it doesn't give most countries that don't have the capability or the knowledge in this arena but have materials, it doesn't give them the wherewithal to be able to do it. They don't have the expertise in many cases. So there is this UN imprimatur of a legal regime that does put this burden on countries, and adding to that the forensic capability to trace, it does some good. I don't think it cures the problem, and I don't think we can rely on deterrence to cure the problem of leakage, and we certainly cannot rely on deterrence to prevent a terrorist group who is both terrorist and suicidal from basically being willing to destroy a large hunk of mankind. So I don't think deterrence can go but so far in that respect. I would add, though, that this is, again, not the whole solution to the problem, but on UN Resolution 1540, I proposed in Russia, it got very little attention, but I hope it will get more attention as people think about it, that one way the United States and Russia could build on their experience in the non-Lugar program, it's gone on for 15 years, is to offer to the IAEA and the Security Council a team of experts. You could start off with maybe 10 or 12 experts from each country that have worked in this nuclear arena in terms of securing weapons and materials, and then offer that to any country in the world that wants assistance, because most of these countries aren't even filling out the 1540 report now. Only like 40% of them have filled out the report, and the reports in most cases are very vague in terms of what they're doing to protect the materials. And I don't think that's bad faith as much as it is a lack of expertise. So I would seriously propose the United States and Russia go global with their experience in terms of under Nunn-Lugar, and basically offer this kind of expertise that teams might grow in the future. It would not be enormously expensive, but it would be enormously helpful to other countries, and it would do something that I think has been lacking, and that is to move Russia from a supplicant for funds under the Nunn-Lugar program to a global player in taking the responsibility for not only their own serious vulnerabilities, but also helping the United States and other countries around the globe. I would say adding Britain and France and China to those kind of teams would also help in the future, and I think it would back up, if we're helping other countries with these best practices and so forth, we better make sure our own house is in order. So I think that would be a step along the direction you're talked about. One of the most difficult things would be if you did find there was leakage from Russia. Certainly no one would advocate sensibly to start a war because of that, even if we'd lost a city, because you'd lose a lot more cities if you did that. A country like Pakistan, that's a great danger. And I think somehow we need to have a breakthrough with Pakistan and India in terms of their own practices, and somehow they need to recognize how much danger they're going to go through before they get to the level of experience of the United States and Russia, because we learned as we went from the 50s and 60s and 70s. So all of those things have to play a role, but in the final analysis, there's no substitute from securing the material itself, and that's where, again, we're in a race between cooperation and catastrophe. Every country has to basically take those steps. You know, I don't know how I don't know what we know at this stage. I'm not up to date on what the latest speculation is on the Anthrax attack that happened here in the United States 2 or 3 months after 9/11. But to show you how difficult this would be, just think about the biological end. For at least the first 2 years of that investigation, they still haven't made conclusions. It looked like the biological supply used for the Anthrax attack, including against the U.S. Capitol offices and so forth, it looked like the suspicions at first was it came from a U.S. supply. Well, we're not immune ourselves from having leakage in the nuclear arena. In fact, the experts in the nuclear arena will tell you one of the hardest things in terms of ever getting, back to our earlier question, all nuclear material absolutely, verifiably, totally 100% confident under control, is that both in the United States and the Soviet Union, over the years, we've lost a lot of nuclear material. There's not a good baseline inventory from which we could say that some is missing because there's been so much leakage over the years. Now, there are all sorts of reasons for the leakage, the processing, the pipes, et cetera, but nevertheless, the truth of it is, if you looked at all the nuclear material produced in the United States, weapon grade, and then you back out what we absolutely have now, there's a big gap there, and there's an even larger gap, I'm sure, in Russia and probably other countries. So this is not one where you can have a nice, clean baseline and proceed with absolute certainty. You have to move the ball as far as you can move it and reduce the risk, as in the Buffett example, as far as you can reduce that risk. But it won't be 100%. It won't be perfect.
Thank you.
Rose?
Thank you very much, Senator. I had a quick comment to make on our last discussion. We had a briefing in Moscow just a couple of weeks ago from a Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs representative to the joint working group, U.S.-Russian working group that is now working on these nuclear terrorism problems. And I think this is not going to be so much an issue of, of course, as you mentioned, deterrence relationship with Russia involved, but rather of cooperation and precedent already beginning to build up. We're already engaged in exercises with the Russians. What would happen if it was found, for example, that Russian-sourced material ended up in terrorist hands? How would it be handled? How would the press be contacted? What would the steps be that would be taken to try to deal with that in policy terms? So I take it as hopeful that both governments have begun to think about this problem and to try to address it in policy terms, even if it's just first baby steps. I think it is important. And I was impressed with how committed, at least the Russian Foreign Ministry, seemed to be to the process. I hope it's a pretty straightforward question for you. We've got an interesting political situation developing in that both Russia and the United States are going to be going through presidential transitions in the next year. And what does the political landscape look like to you for the continuation of our work with Russia on these important problems? There isn't a whole lot of support even today in the U.S. Congress for these kinds of programs. Certainly the Russian Duma is bereft, I think, of good expertise on these issues and political commitments. So I was just wondering, what do you think about the political landscape in the future for working together on nuclear security questions?
Rose, you know more about this than anybody I know, but I'll test my opinion versus yours and defer to you because you have the best judgment on this. But I see, as you've said, erosion of support for the cooperative threat reduction program to some extent in the United States, although there's been a lot of continuity here, and you have to go through re-education process for every new Congress, but God bless Senator Lugar and others who do that. And it seems to me that it has been remarkably sustainable over probably a much longer period of time than either Senator Lugar or I would have envisioned. I think in Russia, either it's going to erode at a much faster clip in the future, it being the cooperative threat reduction effort, or Russia is going to have to play a global role. And I think we need to appeal to their leadership, to their expertise, to their knowledge in this arena in terms of going global. I think the United States and Russia should reach out and form a kind of partnership that goes far beyond the Soviet Union, as I mentioned. One example is 1540 and what we could do in that regard. Another we already are doing with the Global Threat Reduction Initiative, where we are helping them get back that material that they dispersed around the globe. But I think this effort needs to be much more intent. I think we'll either get stronger and make it a bigger effort and go global with it, or it will gradually erode, probably at a more rapid pace in Russia. Pride has a lot to do with it. Psychology has a lot to do with it. And, of course, we all know that with the price of oil almost hitting $100, the Russians have a lot more money of their own. And so I see them hopefully becoming a real partner in this regard. That one is probably more of a political challenge than anything else. I also think we ought to do everything we can to renew the lab-to-lab counter cooperation we had under Sig Hector's guidance. That was a remarkable program. It still has some life in it, but we had our nuclear scientists working with their nuclear scientists in a dramatic and remarkable way. I think we need to do more military to military. If I had the power, I would get the military leaders of the U.S. and Russia together and talk about this warning time challenge and opportunity to greatly reduce the chances of accidental war. If I had the capability, I would get U.S. and Russia biological scientists together on a bilateral basis to begin with because of sensitivity. And I would say, I would hope that President Putin and President Bush or their successors would say, look, we're not planning on using biological weapons against each other. If we were, we would have done it during the Cold War. These weapons have been outlawed since the 1950s. Both of us are doing defensive work now, and to each of us, the other's defensive work looks a lot like offensive. There's a thin line between defensive and offensive. So let's have bilateral transparency on the defensive side of biological. I think that could pour over into the nuclear arena with more cooperation there, because those of you, Rose, who worked in this program know that a lot of the problems on Capitol Hill in terms of suspicion stem from the biological lack of cooperation that pour over into the cooperative threat reduction program. So that's my list of to-dos. But I see a steady erosion of cooperation unless we take it global and have Russia play a partnership role.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Joe Cirincione.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you very much, Senator, for that terrific answer on the Russian political landscape. Can you tell us a little bit about the American political landscape, specifically where you see your initiative with Secretaries Shultz, Kissinger, and Perry going. We had Secretary Baker here this morning, who expressed his support for your initiative. I had the chance to read Governor Schwarzenegger's excellent speech to the Hoover Institution conference just last week, where he expressed his support and offered all of his services to your initiative. It seems to me, if you have the eliminator on your side, you've got something going here. Where do you think your initiative's going? What are the next steps for you?
Joe, was he the eliminator or the terminator?
Well, he was the terminator, but in this role, for this mission, I think we can adjust his nickname.
Eliminator. Okay, that's good. Well, I'm encouraged by the response, and I think that we have, by tying the vision to the action, so that everybody knows unmistakably that this is not a unilateral move. This requires cooperation. This is not a dream world. We know that the vision has to be preceded by a lot of different actions to build the trust and transparency, and to reduce the dangers, as we've talked about. Politically, a couple of the candidates have talked about, the presidential candidates have talked about this, and a lot of others have not either specifically addressed it, or a couple of them have cast doubts about it. But frankly, I have mixed feelings about whether I'd like for this to be injected into the American political process.
Yeah.
Every time I've seen a weapon system or something real serious in the defense arena addressed in a presidential campaign, usually the result has been a setback and not a forward progress. I always thought that when President Carter pledged to eliminate the B-1 bomber, it was the time it should have been built, and when President Reagan pledged to restore it, by the time he built it, it should have been eliminated. So I see this as not as a mixed bag. But I think the next steps that we're talking about having a summary of the recent conference that was at the Hoover Institute. We are also actively planning with the Norwegians a technical conference that would involve European and world experts that would be similar to the Hoover Institute. And George Shultz and I are talking about speaking there. We're talking about what I call a conference of peers. Henry Kissinger and George Shultz have foreign policy peers around the globe. Bill Perry has defense counterparts. I have some peers that I could get together, and we're talking about that kind of conference on an international basis. So we've got to move this whole arena definitely into the international context, and that's what we're talking about now. We're also trying to visualize a theme type movie that would it would not be a drama or anything like that, but it would be at least capture the views of Perry and Kissinger and George Shultz while they're still very active and very mentally astute. I'm 69 years old and I'm the youngster in this crowd, so I think that's very important. I think it's very important for those of us who've been through the Cold War, including many in that room today, to impart to the next generation the experiences we've had and also the vision, so that people will be inspired to move forward from generation to generation. Bill Potter has one of the most significant things going on at his institute, which is the education of young people. Not only young people in the United States, but young people from around the globe, including other nuclear powers. So all of those things are on the agenda. We also, Joe, as you know, we had, on the nuclear material side, we had a consortium of what I call policy institutes, 20 of them from around the globe working together on nuclear materials, and that was very successful. Our foundation, NTI, sponsored that and paid for it. We are thinking about something like that in this arena if the peer group decides that's feasible and possible. So those are all things on the agenda, but it is a moving and working agenda now.
Great. Thank you, Senator.
The last question, Senator, comes from Tarek Raouf.
Good afternoon, Senator. Thank you very much for your excellent speech this morning. The Director General is a big fan of your Wall Street op-ed, in addition to many other things, and most recently he referred to it in his report to the UN General Assembly, which was made on the 29th of October. My question really follows on from Joe's, and this was the international follow-up. Javier Solana is planning a meeting at the foreign minister level to deal with nuclear non-proliferation, nuclear security issues. They were planning for such a meeting in November, but this has been postponed to sometime next year because of the time that is needed for preparation for a meeting at this level. And I was wondering whether this might be one such possible occasion where you or one of the other authors of the Wall Street Journal op-ed might use this opportunity to take this effort really international and to sign up perhaps other former leaders such as Tony Blair or Chirac or Kohl, who still exercise some modicum of influence on their domestic debates, particularly on this important issue of dealing with the legacy of the Cold War and the future of nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Tariq, that's a terrific idea. I didn't know about the conference, but I'm sure if they want one of us to attend, we will do our very best to do so, one or two of us. George Schultz and I are traveling together in February over to Norway, and we probably will make a couple of other stops during that trip. And I know that Henry Kissinger is planning on making some of his own stops. So the answer is yes, that would be very interesting and a great opportunity.
Excuse me.
Finish.
Yes, Senator, I'm sorry. Technical conversation here about teleconferencing. Are we done with the finish? Yeah. Senator, thank you very much.
By the way, if I could add one other comment, Tariq has done more than anybody I know on this whole question of a fuel bank and a series of guarantees so that we can basically encourage countries that want to have nuclear power not to start their own indigenous enrichment capability, which they have the right to do, and it would be a sovereign choice. But Tariq, I hope you all can talk about that some. I know the IAEA has issued a report, and the way I view what you all said is you visualize a tiered kind of approach, so there were a number of assurances for international fuel supply for any country that wants to get into the production of nuclear power, but is willing to refrain from exercising their right to enrich. And I think that's enormously important. And I hope this conference will have a chance to talk about that some, because you've got the real expert there in the room.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you very much for your authoritative insights. We are planning to produce a report on the basis of this conference, which we obviously will share with you. And hopefully we'll have something to say to decision makers. And many thanks for joining us. It's our honor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and thank you for your great service to our country and the world. You've done a wonderful job, and they're fortunate to have you there at Rice.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.